Finding a good Stephen King adaptation is a lot like shopping for a used car. Most of them have something wrong with them, and the really cool looking ones are usually pretty old. Thankfully today, we're talking about a good one. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the shelf, and in this video we're looking at 1990's Misery, directed by Rob Reiner. But I'm not necessarily here to just review the movie. More specifically, I'm going to try to examine this film through a modern lens, and discuss why some of the themes that run throughout Misery can be seen as a sort of precursor to the modern era of film consumption that we're currently living in today. We're going to do this by using two key points. We're going to look at the idea of parasocial relationships and the idea of fans being able to dictate what happens in popular media. But before we get into the meat of it, I do want to talk about the movie briefly just to establish a bit of context. Just as a warning, I will be operating under the assumption that you have at least seen Misery or are familiar with the source material. If you're not, or you haven't, then a lot of what I'm about to talk about may be lost on you. Just so you know. Misery was directed by Rob Reiner, a former actor turned director who is responsible for co-founding Castle Rock Entertainment. Castle Rock, which is named for a fictional town in a lot of Stephen King's novels, has aptly brought us a lot of the most critically acclaimed Stephen King adaptations to date. Films like The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, Dolores Claiborne, and many others. Rob Reiner and his team of co-founders established the company with a particular mission statement. I will paraphrase here, but the mission statement more or less is that for the filmmakers who directed their films, they wanted to allow a lot of creative freedom outside of the pressures of financial success that a lot of big studios would impose on filmmakers. So with the name Castle Rock facilitating an automatic connection between readers and the world of Stephen King, as well as the ability to allow people to be more creative, Castle Rock is without a doubt responsible for bringing us some of the best Stephen King adaptations, like Misery. Misery was the first adaptation of King's work that Castle Rock produced. It's a small-scale story, mostly set in one location, and it's essentially a two-man show with a small cast of supporting characters. The nature of the story made it a suitable candidate for adaptation. The material was already very strong, and with the right actors propping it up, you really couldn't miss. Rob Reiner was also a really great fit to direct here. He was a real natural selection. Being an actor turned director, he was very suitable for storytelling, much the same way that actors turned directors tend to be. Think of people like Clint Eastwood, or current filmmakers today like Tarantino or Greta Gerwig. The casting of James Caan was also a very inspired choice. Caan is known for being very loud and expressive, and being a physical communicator. So the idea of taking that same guy and making him bedridden allowed audiences to see a different side of his acting abilities. Instead, he has to communicate more subtly, relying on facial acting and other nuances. And then you have Kathy Bates as Annie Wilkes, who may very well be the best casting for any movie ever. As far as accuracy, you really couldn't do better. I mean, she really, looked the part and brought an insane level of acting chops to the role and really elevated the material. It's rare in the world of horror films that you get a lot of Oscar recognition, and while I wouldn't consider Misery to be an outright horror film, I would say that it's tangentially related. So the fact that Kathy Bates won the Best Actress award for her role in this film, going up against some pretty heavy hitters as well, I might add, is a nice little feather in the cap of this film. Misery is a shorter book relative to the rest of King's body of work. It's only a little over 300 pages, which is another reason that made it so suitable for a film adaptation. The shorter the book, the less potential of something getting left on the cutting room floor. I look at films like Carrie as another example of a situation like that. Misery is often lauded as being one of the most faithful adaptations of any of King's works. It isn't really a one-to-one, but to be fair, you don't ever really get those. And it's not uncommon for liberties to be taken when adapting books to film. It's also worth mentioning how the snowy weather really lends itself to the atmosphere and the feeling of isolation in this film. The weather is just as much of a villain to Paul as Annie is, in some ways. I did an entire video on snowy horror films and how that feeling of isolation caused by snow can be very effective in a horror film. I'll link that somewhere up top. So I've sung this film's praises. It's very good, but let's get back to the topic of discussion. How is Misery more relevant than ever, 35 years after its release? Essentially what you have at the heart of Misery is a parasocial relationship between a rabid fan and a celebrity. This story is deeply personal to King. He basically wrote it at a time in his career where his fans were starting to build up these really lofty, really high expectations of him. He was kind of suffering from success. This started to cause King to feel the pressure to deliver, ultimately knowing that he would not be able to satisfy everyone. The character of Annie Wilkes, according to Stephen King, is meant to be a metaphor for drugs, specifically the one that starts with a C, and how the addiction to substances can control you, much the same way that Annie controls Paul Sheldon. If we look at Annie herself, she is kind of a caricature of a mentally ill person. She demonstrates so many different forms of mental illness that she starts to sort of become an avatar or a symbol for the mentally ill, rather than a fully fleshed out character in and of herself. In the movie, that is. She demonstrates symptoms of bipolar disorder, personality disorder, psychosis, sadomasochism, and imposes her own moral superiority and these delusions of grandeur to justify her actions with impunity. I wouldn't say there's anything inherently wrong with this depiction in the film, as it serves the story from a cinematic perspective, but in the novel she's much more of a living, breathing person, as opposed to in the film where she's sort of reduced to just a plot device. In the book, both Paul and Annie are dived deeper into as characters, and they're just more fully fleshed out. But for the sake of this video, suffice it to say that while I do think that this is a very good adaptation of a book, you'll often find it's the case that books just have way more substance that can never be adapted to a movie. So essentially what you have is a story about this deeply troubled individual who, in her mind, has this deep connection to somebody who does not know that they exist. This being Paul Sheldon. Annie has been a fan of Paul Sheldon's for a while, clearly expressing like an unhealthy attachment to the material, which in this case is this long-running series of romance novels. So since Annie is not of sound mind, she's not really able to separate her attachment to these novels from the author, Paul Sheldon. This creates a situation where, when she's seemingly put in Paul Sheldon's path through divine intervention, she takes this as a sign that not only are they like meant to be together, but that she's like validated as his #1 fan. And because of this, she therefore feels as though she has some level of authorship over Paul's writing and where the story should go. Right here is where we can start to make some connections to the way things are nowadays. Sometimes people can have a level of entitlement to the media that they really enjoy, especially if they've liked that media for a really long time. People can tend to gatekeep things. I would say it's almost an automatic response and, not something to be faulted, especially when it's a piece of media or an artist that they've liked for a really long time before it was considered mainstream. So, if we look at Annie, she believes that because she saved Paul's life, that she deserves some kind of peek behind the curtain into his writing process. Now, it starts out reasonably enough, but it quickly devolves into Annie exerting her own will into the narrative and forcing Paul to tell the story that she wants to hear. It quickly becomes about what we want, or in this case Annie, and not what the creative person wants, Paul Sheldon in this instance. Is this starting to sound familiar? We now live in a time where the creators of our favorite movies and TV shows are not these like unattainable deities. In a lot of cases, they're online, just like us. And to some extent, we can actually communicate with them and express what we like and don't like. This allows for there to become a dialogue of sorts, however muffled it may be, to express grievances or sing praises. This speaks to a larger issue in modern society where everyone is simply too online. Maybe that's a general statement. Not everyone is like chronically online, but I think we can all kind of agree that there are people who are simply too online. Prior to the advent of social media and widespread internet, people lived in a time where if their favorite character died in their favorite TV show, they just kind of had to live with it. Now, there's no guarantee that they would ever receive it, but I suppose if you wanted to, you could write a strongly worded letter to the creator expressing your disagreement.
I guess that don't leave me with no choice but to be a mature-ass adult about this shit. I'm working on my temper. But know that I strongly disagree with this.
but like that was pretty much it. Nowadays, if somebody's tweet gets enough engagement, there's a strong chance that the creator will eventually see it. We see this all the time with people like James Gunn, very active on Twitter and responds to a lot of questions that people ask him. I wouldn't say this is inherently a bad thing because it allows people to feel, closer to the material and the creatives that make the material that they like. But I would argue that this can be a detriment. Now, you might be thinking, I don't know, man, do people really have that much control over the way that their media unfolds? Probably not, right? The problem is that despite how small the chances are, the precedent does exist. For the biggest example of this, look no further than the sequel trilogy of Star Wars films from Disney. Now, before I explain myself here, I just want to provide the disclaimer that despite my personal feelings on the sequel trilogy, I think we can all agree that the single biggest problem with it is that it was lacking a singular creative vision. If we can all agree on that, then I think we'll be okay to move forward. Now, this is obviously an extreme example, but it serves to emphasize that the bigger the piece of media, the more eyes that are on it, and therefore the more subject it can be to influence by disgruntled fans in this case. Essentially, J.J. Abrams told a familiar, safe story that was generally considered to be a promising start to a new trilogy. You with me so far? Then, Rian Johnson was called in, and he shook things up drastically, creating a rift between Star Wars fans right down the middle. Fearing this backlash and hoping to unite the fans again, Disney brought back JJ, and he gave us The Rise of Skywalker, which was a very messy film that really poorly tried to appeal to the sensibilities of The Force Awakens and Rian Johnson's Last Jedi, which ultimately left us with a movie that was made for nobody. What can we learn from this? This tells us that authorship and a singular vision are what make these properties we love so good to begin with. So for the sake of my point, imagine that Annie Wilkes is an angry Redditor and Paul Sheldon is Disney. Kathleen Kennedy, if you will, for the sake of the visual. She's unable to recognize that the reason that she likes the Misery novels is because of Paul's creative voice. And if she's really a true fan, then she should probably just, accept the creative decisions made. Now, I'm a fan of plenty of creatives in the film industry, right? We all are. There's nothing wrong with being a really big supporter of somebody whose work has moved you. However, like in any fandom, there are always those people who take things too far. The reality is that there are some people who, due to the circumstances of their personal lives, create these parasocial relationships with celebrities who just don't know they exist, right? When taken to the very extreme end of the spectrum, you get stalker situations in Misery where things can get dangerous. Mostly these things are limited to online spaces where the only consequences are to that of a person's mental health. Again, I just want to say, I'm not bashing anyone who really likes Taylor Swift or happens to run a Timothée Chalamet fan account on Twitter. There are levels to this. The reality is that some people are already predisposed to exhibit this kind of behavior, and sometimes it can just manifest through either a piece of media or a particular celebrity that they're a big fan of. I'm by no means an expert in this kind of stuff. I just think it's interesting to look at the way that Annie Wilkes' character can be seen to imitate real-world behaviors, especially in the modern day. I find that in many ways that I doubt even Stephen King himself could have predicted, Misery has become eerily prophetic. It's at this point that I just want to be very clear that I don't think Stephen King was necessarily writing a story that was intended to be seen as the allegory that I'm making it out to be, right? I just think it's compelling that today the story can be seen as this allegory warning against the dangers of parasocial relationships. A sort of cautionary tale, if you will. The beauty of art is that despite the intent of the creator, art can go on to live a very long life and mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think we've seen a bit of that with Misery today. I just think it's sort of interesting that Stephen King's story, which has been stated to be a metaphor about his own battles with drug addiction, can also be seen as a metaphor for the age we live in today, where social media has given everyone a voice. And if the author is listening, then your voice may just be heard, for better or for worse. Alright guys, so that's my thoughts on Misery and how it's sort of more relevant today than ever. I find looking at movies like this, through a certain lens, under a certain microscope, is a little bit more interesting than just kind of reviewing the movie, right? We've all seen Misery, or at least if you're watching this, you probably have. So rather than kind of do a conventional, retrospective, I like to shake things up a little bit and look at things, try to find parallels to today, how a movie has aged and what allows it to, be regarded in a new light. A lot of times people look at movies and there's often these sort of revisionist narratives that people can apply to them. And despite whether or not the director intended it, it can sort of function in that way. And that, like I said, that's the cool thing about art. So hopefully this wasn't me just kind of blowing smoke up your asses for however many minutes, and maybe this kind of landed with some of you. Hopefully it did. If you like this kind of video, please let me know. I do intend to do more of them, so it'll be nice to get some feedback from you guys. Check out that video I did on snowy horror. I think it's pretty solid, and since it's January, pretty relevant. So hit the like button if you liked the video, subscribe if you haven't. We talk about new movies, old movies, physical media, and horror in general. So with that being said, please take care and watch more movies.